we all know, this game can be complicated, to put it lightly. When something can or can't happen, and what we can or can't do, it can be pretty hard to determine sometimes. And sometimes that's not solved by just reading the card. Today we are going to be going over the interactions that happen once in a blue moon. Just situations that are rare to come by in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's pretty common in today's meta to run a Monster Reborn type effect on a monster like Hida or Dark to link climb into a boss monster. Let's say there's an Albion, the branded dragon, and there's a Dark trying to summon it. Depending on how the branded dragon got there determines whether or not you can actually summon it. If it was fusion summoned out of the extra deck, then Dark can summon it. But if it was sent there by a Mirror Jade, Dark cannot summon it. The reason why is because it wasn't properly summoned from the extra deck. The common response to this when this comes up is, it doesn't say that on the card. That's because it's a rule applied to the mechanic itself. When Master Rule 4 was introduced, it removed the ability for you to summon extra deck monsters from the graveyard if they weren't properly summoned out of the extra deck first. Properly summoned meaning if they were fusion, synchro, Xyz, or linked summoned first. Or if they were summoned by their alternative summoning condition in the case of APC Dragon Buster and Thunder Dragon Colossus. So if a monster was cheated out of the extra deck, like let's say with a Blue Eye Spirit Dragon summoning a light dragon synchro monster, and then that monster was sent to the graveyard, or if a monster was sent there by Diviner or Mirror Jade, since they weren't summoned by their summoning condition, they can't be revived by the effect of a Charmer monster or any other reborn effect. I think the reason why people forget about this rule to the extra deck is because it only comes up every so often, like maybe every other meta, and people forget about it and have to remember it again when there's a meta-relevant deck that use these types of reborn effects. Or when they're using these types of reborn effects, they're usually targeting like Ash Blossom or some main deck monster. It's almost never on an extra deck monster, but when they do, that's when this applies. Typically, monsters with a trigger effect will have the word if indicating the conditions for the effect to activate and where they apply. However, there are trigger effects that say when, and it's really easy to miss timing on these effects. That's because the effects has to be applied exactly when the conditions are met and not if the conditions are met. Meaning the conditions for a win effect has to be the very last thing that happens in the chain. And there's a couple of different examples for the current meta that this applies to. Branded Lost states that the activation of your cards and effects that include an effect that fusion summons a fusion monster cannot be negated. Also, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects when a monster is fusion summoned this way. It's that one word, when, that grants whether or not your monster gains protection. So if your opponent activates Opening of the Spirit Gates to add a monster that mentions one of the Sacred Beasts on it, and you respond with Branded in Red, you won't be able to get the protection that Lost provides, because the last thing that's happening is the adding of Dark Beckoning Beast and not the summoning of Sanctifier. So if you try to use Sanctifier to bring out the gimmick puppet you surely have in your graveyard, your opponent can still respond with the Forbidden Droplet they have in their hand and go about their merry day of comboing off. However, if you wait for the Opening of the Spirit Gates to resolve, and then use Branded in Red, then you gain the protection that Lost provides, make it so your opponent can't respond, and you can gimmick puppet your opponent without a fear of Droplet. This is generate fun. Another example is when Crimson Dragon summons Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity. King Calamity reads, when this card is synchro summoned, you can activate this effect. For the rest of this turn, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects on the field your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation. In order for King Calamity to lock your opponent out of cards or effects on the field, it has to be the last thing that happens. So if your opponent uses Imperm on your Crimson Dragon, and you use Crimson Dragon targeting whatever level 12 you have to bring up King Calamity, it doesn't work, and it just effectively does the same thing your opponent was trying to do in the first place, because King Calamity being summoned was not the last thing that happened. It was Imperm leaving the field. And I learned that the hard way. Let's say your opponent used SP Little Knight to remove Mirror Jade off of the field, and you use Mirror Jade's end phase effect to Raigeki your opponent's side of the board. But SP Little Knight and Mirror Jade return to the field during the end phase. Which effect resolves first? It's dependent on whose turn it is. If the turn player is your opponent who activated Little Knight, they have the priority to decide if they want to resolve Little Knight first, which they can decline to resolve at that point. Then you have the priority to resolve Mirror Jade, where you're also allowed to decline the resolution. Priority then return to the player that activated SP Little Knight, where they are forced to resolve Little Knight, bringing back both SP and Mirror Jade. Then priority is returned back to you to resolve Mirror Jade's end phase effect to Raigeki the field. If it's your turn, the opposite happens. You can choose to not resolve Mirror Jade, your opponent can choose not to resolve Little Knight, then priority is returned back to you, forcing you to resolve Mirror Jade to Raigeki the field, and then your opponent is forced to resolve SP Little Knight, meaning SP Little Knight is on the board with Mirror Jade. No matter what, the end phase effects have to resolve. The order of which they resolve is dependent on the turn player. The turn player will resolve first if they are forced to. As I was wrapping up the script for this video, I realized that I used Branded in every example here. I wasn't intending to do that, but it just sort of happened. In any case, let me know about some rare or interesting rulings you've come across in the comments down below. And while you're down there, subscribe to the channel. And I will see you all next time. Goodbye.